Okay, Tuberistas, Libya time again, even though it's Newsweek. In the September 5th issue thereof, are three pieces on Libya. In the first, in the blurb, we read, the dictator's fall is proof that America can still topple a rogue regime. Okay, well, I didn't see any Americans putting their lives on the line in Libya. This is but typical American rhetoric, blowing its narcissistic self-importance up the world's ass, if it wasn't for a certain turd of truth, and that the Libyan uprising has been effectively shanghaied by NATO to create a proxy client regime to ensure the free flow of its oil wealth, unencumbered by Gaddafi and his legacy, and more particularly the contracts he signed with the West. And of course, one of the first acts of liberation was to climb up the Tripoli statue of an American warplane in the grip of the Libyan fist. Missile still beats dictator, gloats Newsweek. Note, not the Libyan people who put their lives on the line, but our missiles. Typical American contempt for the natives it exploits as the prelude to exploiting the country's resources. Colonialism isn't dead by any means. It just dresses itself up in democratic bullshit like a century and a half ago it dragged out in Christian benevolence. This particular item here also quotes George Bush's 2002 strategy document. America must stand firmly for the non-negotiable demands of human dignity, the rule of law, limits on the absolute power of the state, free speech, freedom of worship, equal justice, respect for women, religious and ethnic tolerance, and respect for private property. The most obvious lesson of the Bush presidency, unfortunately, is that toppling the tyrant is the easy part. Ensuring that all those nice human rights now take root in Libya is going to be much tougher. Well, yes, and not just for Libya, but especially for you people in the West making all these policy judgments. A good example of how you folks really feel about Arab democracy is demonstrated in the Kingdom of Morocco. The present king showed his reforming liberal credentials by drafting a new constitution and putting it to a referendum on July 1st of 2011. Well, here's the new democratic order in Morocco. The king is no longer a sacred person, just an inviolable person. The pro-yes campaign for the constitutional referendum received 90% of media time, public advertising like billboards and banners, with young people paid by the royal government to carry around flags in the king's picture. Mosque leaders were ordered to read the same pro-yes sermon. Major companies ordered their employees to vote yes. When a news reporter dared to mention the marginalized No campaign, the prime minister had him pulled from the air and his anchor chair fumigated, no doubt. So when the vote was taken, lo and also behold, 99% of the vote is pro-yes with a nearly three-quarters voter turnout. The same kind of results Soviet voters would return for Joseph Stalin, maybe even less. And this is the Moroccan exception, America's model for the Arab world. President Sarkozy of France and Hillary Clinton could call it an admirable model. Ken Pollock of the Brookings Institution called it a model of reform for the Middle East, and Lee Smith of the Weekly Standard says Morocco is on its way to democracy and is on the winning side of a fundamental confrontation between obscurantism and democracy. I guess that also covers the voting irregularities, like looking the other way at people with expired ID cards who were not checked against voter lists. The Moroccan people were not given freedom from servitude, just better conditions of servitude. Like Benito Juarez said of Maximilian von Habsburg, imposed King of Mexico, he gives us everything except the right to govern ourselves. No surprises here, the usual public deification of democracy while partnering with the devil because, in the end, the devil is one of us. That's why the mad dictator of Tripoli had to be removed, because he's not one of us. That's the end game of the freedom, democracy, and human rights NATO missiles were raining down on the African Sahel. Elsewhere in this tripe, we find, turning quickly to page 38, not easy to do because for commercial reasons they often skip the page numbers, but anyway, we find good riddance Gaddafi. Many fear turmoil and strife after the dictator's fall. In fact, there's no reason to believe that Libya will be just fine. Well, that's true too. The article concludes that in fact, there's reason to believe that Libya will be just fine. My bad. Well, isn't that just a bit of typical Pollyanna crapola? Of course, to ensure this, the West should provide all the help Libya needs. With the West deciding what those needs are, of course, creating a new pro-Western elite dependent on Western handouts while letting its people sink in shit, as in Egypt for 30 years. Well, next to this is a piece on the fall of the raving mad monster. And here we have a loving outline of Gaddafi's lunacy over most of the last half century. And of course, comparing him to Hugo Chavez, another madman for comparing Shrub Jr. to Satan. Wow, what a loose grip on reality there. When obviously Bush was just a prancing little imp in tight red pants. And of course, Ahmadinejad comes in for his kick in the nuts for trying to acquire nuclear weapons in the face of world opinion. Well, excuse me, but who's stiffed or cheated on every proliferation treaty? The US of A and Israel. If Iran's president is a nuclear wacko, he's in good company in Washington and Jerusalem. And the purpose of NATO's bombing was, of course, as we see here, humanitarian intervention, just to stop the mad dictator from washing the streets in blood. So, the rebels are now in charge of those streets, and what do we find? Dark-skinned contract workers are executed and left to rot because they are not true Libyans, and obviously all of them were Gaddafi's henchmen. Well, hopefully for these people enjoying their victory in Libya, it's just a phase, because if the streets do run red much longer, it will give NATO the new excuse for boots on the ground to stabilize the situation it did so much to create. Now the frozen Libyan assets in the West are all being released, I'm sure to end up in the right pockets, where they've been going all along. According to the New York Times of July the 2nd, 2011, the Libyan government lost hundreds of millions of dollars in Western investment of Libyan Investment Authority funds, with hundreds of millions of dollars in investment fees as left over, of course. Not only is none of that swindled money going to be returned to the new Libyan government, certainly not its people, I guarantee you as you sit there that the top priority of the released assets will be to pay these Western investment banks the arreared fees. Now with Gaddafi gone, they hope to keep that loot. You think that had anything to do with the mantra of Gaddafi's got to go? It's all such transparent bullshit, and Sarkozy and Clinton are not a goddamn bit better than Gaddafi, who at least was an honest thug. A lot will be coming out about the West's relationship with Libya thanks to forthcoming WikiLeaks revelations. I strongly advise anyone interested in this topic or in WikiLeaks in general to subscribe to Skid Row Radio, formerly known as Ujama Flipper, and check out his videos on these subjects. He's constantly staying on top of these stories, and I've left a link to his channel in the underbar for anyone wishing to follow the doings of NATO interventions, the so-called War on Terror, or more rightly called the War of Terror, the National Security State, and all those good things. You should be checking those out for always, not just once in a while, mind you, but every goddamn time. Hello? Who? Benito Mussolini. Man, y'all going to get my landlines under surveillance yet. Echelon's already wired in. What? What can I do for you, old double deuces? Just because I mentioned Juarez and your daddy named you after him? Oh, you want a formal posthumous apology from the United Nations and NATO. For what? Because it's the successor to the pre-war League of Nations, and the League of Nations condemned you for invading Libya to enforce the rule of Western civilization and culture, and for terminating the anti-Western jihadist Omar al-Mukhtar. Well, so what if you had to clean out 100,000 people and stuff them in concentration camps, huh? Look how many supported you anyway and fought for you in the Italian army. And now NATO's doing the same damn thing and you want an apology. Well, you know what? I don't blame you. I think it's a double standard too. How about it, Hillary? You can take it for the King of Morocco as a leader of democratic reform. You can do the same thing for old dog Benito.